Imagine you've had major surgery, maybe a hip replacement. You get asked later, perhaps a year or two on, how you're doing via a questionnaire. Now, this feedback, yours and thousands of others, helps gauge how successful these operations really are. Seems simple enough, right? But what if the people who don't send back those forms, what if they aren't just, randomly busy? What if they're actually a specific group and their absence completely changes the picture of success that the data shows us? That's the crucial question we're exploring today on the deep dive. We're looking closely at a particular research paper on patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs, after a total hip replacement, and the significant bias that can crop up when patients don't complete their follow-up. Now, these PROMs, they're really vital tools. Organizations like NICE here in the UK or the FDA over in the US use them to understand the real-world impact of surgery beyond just, say, survival rates or basic complications. They're meant to capture the patient's own view on their quality of life, their recovery. And joining us to walk us through this paper and this, critical area of healthcare research is Professor Mo Imam. Professor Imam is a leading orthopedic surgeon and researcher, very involved in outcomes analysis, and importantly, one of the authors of the actual study we're discussing today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So maybe let's set the scene with some headline numbers from your study. You tracked patients having total hip replacements, looked at their response rates to questionnaires over time. How did that response rate change from before the operation?
Well, our initial capture rate preoperatively was actually excellent, almost 99%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But yes, as time went on, we did see a steady decline. At 6 weeks after the operation, it was down to about 90.6%.
Right.
By 6 months, it had dipped slightly further to 89%.
Ugh.
Then 1 year out, it was 83%. And by the time we reached the 2-year mark, we were down to 79% response.
79%. So quite a drop.
Yes, a considerable proportion of that initial group was, no longer providing feedback at that point.
So doing the maths quickly, that's roughly a fifth of the original patients who aren't represented in that 2-year data. Now, was that drop off just random chance? Did it happen sort of equally across all patient types? Or did your analysis find specific things linked to who didn't respond?
Our analysis was very clear on this point. The non-response was absolutely not random.
Right.
We found quite significant associations between certain patient characteristics and their likelihood of responding to those follow-up questionnaires.
Okay. And that's really the crux of it, isn't it? So tell us, who were these patients who were less likely to respond? What did your study identify?
Well, we found several key factors. One was age.
Age. Interesting.
Yes, the non-responders were significantly younger than the responders. And this is true at all the follow-up points, with a p-value less than 0.001, so highly significant.
Okay.
For instance, at the 2-year point, the median age of those who responded was about 69. But for the non-responders, the median age was 65.
And why might that be? Does the paper suggest reasons?
Well, the paper speculates a bit. It could be linked to younger patients perhaps having busier working lives, finding it harder to make time for questionnaires, or maybe feeling, less connected to the healthcare system once that immediate post-op phase is over.
Okay. Younger patients not responding. That's quite an interesting finding, maybe a bit counterintuitive. What else stood out?
Another really significant factor, and this is something we highlighted as quite a novel finding in this specific context, was the association with deprivation.
Deprivation. How did you measure that?
We used the Income Deprivation Affecting Children Index, the IDACI score. It gives a measure of socioeconomic deprivation for an area here in the UK. And we saw that patients from more deprived areas, those with higher IDCI scores, were significantly less likely to respond.
Right.
Again, this was a very robust finding, p-value less than 0.001, and it held true across all the time points we looked at.
And the reasons for that?
Likely multifaceted, I'd say.
Right.
It could involve things like lower health literacy, perhaps, or maybe less stable housing or social situations, or simply, having other more pressing concerns in their daily lives that mean completing and returning a form just isn't a priority.
So age and socioeconomic background are factors. What about their actual health status before the surgery? Did their starting point matter?
Yes, it mattered profoundly. We found that patients who were less likely to respond later on had significantly lower preoperative scores on both the Oxford Hip Score and the EQ-5D.
Right. The Oxford Hip Score measures pain and function specifically for the hip.
Exactly. So those who started with a worse baseline, meaning more pain, more functional limitation before their surgery, were actually less likely to engage with the follow-up process afterwards. To give you an example, patients who responded to all the post-op questionnaires had a median baseline OHS of 20. But those who missed all of them, they started lower, with a median OHS of just 16.
So that suggests that poor health-related quality of life right at the beginning is some kind of predictor for non-response later.
It certainly seems to be, yes.
And maybe most tellingly, you looked at whether a patient's previous experience or their score at an earlier point influenced whether they responded next time. What did that show about why people might not respond?
Yes, this finding, I think, really strengthens the argument for disengagement being linked to the outcome itself. We found a strong correlation. If a patient had lower outcome scores or reported lower satisfaction at an earlier time point, they were significantly less likely to respond to the next questionnaire down the line.
Ah, okay.
So, for example, patients who didn't respond at the 24-month mark, their median Oxford HIP score back at the 12-month follow-up was 38. Compare that to those who did respond at 24 months. Their median OHS at 12 months was 43.
That's a 5-point difference. Is that significant?
It is, yes. It's clinically meaningful and statistically significant. It strongly implies that if a patient felt they weren't achieving the outcome they'd hoped for, or perhaps wasn't satisfied with their result or the service received, they were then less inclined to participate in future data collection. It's almost like they've, well, voted with their feet by simply not responding.
That's a really powerful insight. It suggests it's not always just about practical barriers, but maybe a psychological disengagement based on how well they feel they've done.
Precisely.
Were there any factors you perhaps expected to be linked to non-response but actually weren't, according to your study?
Well, interestingly, in our particular cohort, we didn't find a significant link between gender or whether the patient experienced surgical or medical complications after the operation and their likelihood of responding.
Really? No link to complications?
Not a statistically significant one in our data set, no. And the paper does note that the finding on gender actually differs from some other studies out there, which just highlights, I suppose, that the factors influencing non-response can vary a bit depending on the specific patient group and the setting you're looking at.
Right, context matters. Okay, so we've got a clearer picture now of who tends to be missing from this follow-up data. Younger patients, those from more deprived areas, and crucially, those who started with lower scores or had poorer outcomes or satisfaction earlier on. So let's bridge that now to the core problem this paper really tackles, the bias. If that specific group is less likely to respond, what does it fundamentally mean for the outcome data that we do see reported?
Well, the fundamental consequence, the big issue, is that the reported outcomes from these data sets or registries that suffer from significant loss to follow-up are inherently biased.
Biased how?
Because the group that is disproportionately not responding are the very patients with the worst scores, perhaps less improvement or lower satisfaction. So the group that does respond is therefore skewed. It's weighted towards patients who are, generally speaking, doing well and are satisfied.
So the picture of success painted by those who reply is potentially overly optimistic compared to what the entire group of patients actually experience.
Precisely. And our study provides some quite concrete evidence for this bias. We look at the actual improvement in the Oxford HIP score from baseline to follow-up. At 12 months, the median improvement for patients who responded was 3 points higher than for those who didn't respond at that point.
3 points higher.
And by 24 months, that difference had actually widened slightly to 4 points.
4 points. Now, does that difference, 3 or 4 points, sound small? Or is it meaningful?
While it might sound small numerically, it's statistically significant, and it represents a tangible skew in the reported outcome data. If you only look at the responders, you are seeing results that are, on average, notably better than what the non-responders actually experienced.
And is this issue, this sort of biased non-response, is it unique to hip replacements or PROMS data? Or is it a much wider concern in healthcare data and registries generally?
Oh, it's a much broader concern. This phenomenon where loss to follow-up isn't random, where it represents a subset with different and often less favorable outcomes, well, that's a critical consideration that really extends far beyond just hip PROMS. It's relevant for, I'd say, virtually any study or registry data set that relies on ongoing patient participation or follow-up over time.
So any long-term tracking?
Yes. The paper touches on its importance for survival analysis in joint replacement registries, for instance. And it acknowledges that the profile of non-responders might differ depending on the procedure. For example, with hip resurfacing, you might actually lose younger, more active patients to follow up precisely because they're doing so well and have just got back to their busy lives. That's a different dynamic to what we saw in total hip replacements. But the key point remains. The missing data is rarely, if ever, random.
You also made a really fascinating comparison in the paper between the UK's national PROMS data and the Swedish hip arthroplasty register. What did that comparison tell you about the impact of response rates?
Ah, yes, that comparison offers quite powerful sort of external support for our findings on bias. The Swedish registry, you see, consistently achieves a significantly higher response rate, typically around 90%.
90%, that's high.
It is. Compare that to the national UK PROMS data, which was around 80% at the time we did our study. Now, what's really striking is that despite presumably performing similar surgeries with similar patients, the Swedish registry reported a lower patient satisfaction rate, about 84% satisfied. That's compared to a much higher rate, over 95% reporting improvement, in the UK PROMS data with its lower response rate.
So, high response rate, lower reported satisfaction. How does that support the bias idea?
Well, our interpretation is that because the Swedish registry captures a larger proportion of the total patient population, including more of those patients with less ideal outcomes, their reported satisfaction rate is actually a more accurate reflection. It's naturally lower because it includes more of the less satisfied people. It really underscores how the response rate itself directly impacts the picture of success that gets reported.
That makes sense. So, given this significant bias that can creep in, what are some potential ways forward? What strategies or efforts does the paper mention to try and reduce this loss to follow up and get a more complete picture?
The paper really emphasizes that substantial effort is needed, first to understand, and then to overcome the barriers stopping patients from following up. This could involve practical things, beyond just sending out standard postal questionnaires, offering different ways to respond, maybe email or telephone calls, perhaps even app-based systems.
Using technology more?
Potentially, yes. And also considering things like language barriers, or providing extra assistance for patients who might have lower literacy levels, or perhaps less access to digital technology. It's really about making the process as easy and accessible as we can for all patient groups, particularly those we've now identified as being less likely to respond otherwise.
Right, targeting the effort. And just briefly, what were some of the limitations of your own study that you acknowledged? Important for context.
Yes, of course. Like any research, there were limitations. We didn't have access to really comprehensive sociodemographic details for all patients, things like education level or specific language needs. Nor did we have detailed clinical data on comorbidities or mental health conditions, which could certainly also influence response.
Okay.
Also, it's worth noting, a low HIP score isn't always solely due to the hip surgery itself. It can be influenced by other coexisting health conditions. And while our institutional data capture rate was relatively high compared to the national average at the time, these findings would definitely benefit from being validated in other populations and different healthcare settings.
Transparency about limitations is always good practice. Okay, let's switch gears slightly lightning round. Quick questions, sharp insights. Professor, what's the single most crucial takeaway for anyone looking at patient feedback data?
Assume non-responders are different, and assume their outcomes are likely less favorable than those who did respond. Never take the data you have as the whole picture, unless your follow-up is near perfect.
Good point. If you could implement one change tomorrow to improve PROM's data quality based purely on this study, what would it be?
I'd shift focus and, importantly, resources towards actively understanding why certain patients aren't responding, and then putting targeted strategies in place to try and re-engage them or capture their feedback effectively.
Makes sense. And finally, what's the one essential question professionals should always ask themselves when they see published outcome data that's based on patient feedback?
Always ask, what was the follow-up rate? And crucially, was any attempt made to characterize the non-responders? Because the lower that response rate, the greater the potential for bias, and the more cautious you absolutely must be about the conclusions being drawn from it.
Excellent. Very clear points. So just to recap some of the most crucial takeaways from our deep dive today for everyone listening. Firstly, patient response rates in long-term studies like PROMS often drop off significantly, which leaves quite a substantial gap in the data we collect. Secondly, and this is critical, this non-response isn't just random. Studies like the one we've discussed show that the patients less likely to respond are often younger, come from more deprived areas, and significantly had lower baseline scores or experienced poorer outcomes and satisfaction earlier on. Thirdly, this leads directly to a major issue: bias. The reported outcome data, based only on those patients who do respond, is likely painting an overly positive picture compared to the true average outcome for all patients because those less successful results are disproportionately missing. Fourthly, this isn't just an orthopedics issue. This problem of non-random loss to follow-up and the bias it creates is a vital thing to consider for anyone working with patient-reported outcomes, registry data, or really any research relying on ongoing patient feedback over time. And finally, getting a genuinely accurate understanding of how well treatments are truly working requires real, dedicated effort to understand and reduce the barriers to follow-up, making sure the voices and experiences of patients who had less favorable outcomes are also included, so we get a more complete and much less biased picture. That was a really essential deep dive into a critical aspect of healthcare data validity. Understanding this potential for bias in patient follow-up is just fundamental for anyone making decisions based on these kinds of metrics. And if you found this deep dive valuable, please do take a moment to rate and share the show. It really helps other professionals discover insights like these.
Yes, I think this research really does underscore that the methodology of how we collect data profoundly impacts the reliability of the conclusions we can draw about clinical effectiveness. It pushes us all, I hope, to be more critical consumers of outcome data.
Absolutely. So, perhaps a final thought for you to consider as you look at outcome data in your own professional world. Always pause and ask yourself who might not be represented in these numbers, and what might their story and their outcome truly be.